Late autumn, 1945. Tokyo's outskirts are quiet in a way they have never been before. The air carries the smell of ash and damp wood. Streets once crowded with bicycles and street vendors now lie broken, edged by blackened foundations and roofless homes. A child stands near a collapsed wall, thin coat pulled tight, watching unfamiliar boots move through the rubble. They are not marching. They are walking. American soldiers, young, dusty, carrying the weight of a war just finished, pause where children gather. The children do not run. They have been taught to fear this moment. For years, these faces were described only as monsters from the sky. One soldier kneels. His rifle stays slung behind him. From his pocket, he pulls something small. Not food. Not medicine. A toy. Worn. Ordinary. Carried across the Pacific in a duffel bag meant for survival, not generosity. The child does not reach for it at first. Around them, adults watch in silence. No orders are shouted. No flags are raised. The war, officially ended weeks earlier, is still present in every breath, but something has shifted. This quiet exchange, repeated across a defeated nation, will become part of a much larger transformation, rooted in how Japan arrived at this moment. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation exhausted beyond endurance. For nearly 15 years, the country had been mobilized for total war. Industry, education, media, and family life had been bent toward imperial expansion and survival. By 1944, the strain was visible everywhere. American submarine warfare had severed Japan's maritime lifelines. Food imports collapsed. Cities depended on ration cards that offered less each month, sometimes nothing at all. Then the bombing intensified. From March to August 1945, American B-29s reduced Japan's urban centers to ashes. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10 alone killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people and left over 1 million homeless. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, each suffered similar destruction. Wooden homes burned quickly. Families fled with only what they could carry. Children learned to sleep in fields, temples, and half-standing factories. On August 6 and August 9, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shock was total. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would follow in the weeks and months ahead. For Japanese civilians, especially children, the world became a place of sudden silence, where adults whispered, and the sky itself was feared. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. His voice, never before heard by the public, announced Japan's acceptance of the Allied surrender terms. For many listeners, the language was formal and indirect. For children, the meaning was simpler. The war was over. But no one knew what peace would look like. Years of wartime indoctrination had prepared the population for occupation with terror. Government leaflets and radio broadcasts warned of American brutality. Civilians were told that enemy soldiers would kill men, violate women, and enslave children. In some areas, officials distributed poison or encouraged suicide rather than capture. School children were trained to resist with bamboo spears if invasion came. Instead of invasion, occupation arrived. On August 28, 1945, advance elements of the U.S. 8th Army landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. Within days, tens of thousands of Allied troops entered the capital and surrounding regions. General Douglas MacArthur assumed command as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, tasked with governing Japan on behalf of the victorious Allies. The contrast between expectation and reality was immediate and disorienting. There was no mass retribution, no public executions, no widespread violence. American troops were ordered to maintain discipline, avoid unnecessary force, and project calm authority. Strict rules govern conduct. Fraternization with civilians was officially discouraged at first, but cruelty was explicitly forbidden. For Japanese adults, survival became the priority. For children, survival was intertwined with confusion. Schools were closed or damaged. Fathers were missing, dead, or returning defeated from distant fronts. Mothers bartered clothing for rice. Hunger hollowed faces across the country. In this landscape, American soldiers became unavoidable figures in daily life. They guarded warehouses, patrolled streets, requisitioned buildings. They were everywhere, and yet, increasingly, they were not what children had been taught to expect. That growing gap between fear and reality would soon shape countless small encounters, as occupation policies met the raw human needs of a shattered society. The American occupation of Japan was not improvised. It was planned in detail, shaped by hard lessons from Europe and guided by a singular strategic goal: prevent Japan from ever returning to militarism while avoiding the chaos that punitive occupation could unleash. From the outset, SCAP policy emphasized stability. Japanese institutions were not dismantled wholesale. The emperor was retained as a symbolic figure. Local governments continued to function under supervision. Order, not revenge, defined the occupation's first months. For civilians, especially children, this approach produced an unusual reality. The men who had dropped bombs now stood in schoolyards. The soldiers who had been described as demons directed traffic and distributed rations. Fear did not vanish overnight, but it was slowly replaced by observation. Food was the central crisis. By late 1945, Japan faced near-famine conditions. Domestic agriculture had been disrupted by labor shortages, bombing, and fertilizer scarcity. Urban populations were particularly vulnerable. Children showed signs of malnutrition, swollen bellies, stunted growth, thinning hair. Hospitals reported rising cases of tuberculosis and deficiency diseases. The coming winter threatened mass starvation. In response, the United States authorized large-scale food imports. Between 1945 and 1946, millions of tons of grain were shipped to Japan under occupation authority. These supplies were not charity in the traditional sense. They were strategic relief, designed to stabilize society and prevent unrest. But their impact was personal. School lunch programs were reintroduced. Children lined up with bowls and tin cups. For many, it was the first full meal in months. Alongside food came smaller, unofficial gestures. American soldiers arrived with personal effects from home: photographs, letters, cigarettes, candy, and sometimes toys. Many were barely out of their teens. Some were fathers themselves. Others had younger siblings they had not seen in years. In the quiet spaces between patrols, encounters with Japanese children stirred emotions the battlefield had suppressed. Officially, fraternization was restricted. Commanders feared favoritism, black markets, and loss of authority. Yet enforcement was uneven. The rules softened as occupation leadership recognized the propaganda value of calm, humane interaction. Images of smiling children beside American soldiers circulated in newspapers back home. They contrasted sharply with the memory of Pearl Harbor and island fighting. The American Red Cross and other organizations reinforced this shift. Clothing drives sent coats and shoes. Relief agencies distributed soap, pencils, and school supplies. Toys, simple, durable objects, appeared in care packages and relief shipments. They were not prioritized items, but they mattered. For Japanese children raised in scarcity and discipline, toys had been rare even before the war. During the final years, play had almost disappeared. Scrap drives consumed metal and rubber. Wooden blocks replaced manufactured goods. Many children owned nothing at all. When American soldiers shared toys, the act carried layers of meaning. It was not just generosity. It was an inversion of everything the war had taught. The enemy did not take. He gave. He knelt to a child's height. He smiled. Japanese parents watched these moments with caution. Accepting gifts from the occupier challenged pride and deeply ingrained narratives. Yet hunger, exhaustion, and concern for their children softened resistance. Gratitude and humiliation existed side by side. By early 1946, such scenes were no longer rare. They occurred in city streets, near barracks, outside schools, and along rural roads. They were small, unrecorded exchanges, except when cameras captured them. Those photographs would later come to define the human face of occupation. But at the time, they were simply moments unfolding within a larger transformation, seen differently depending on who was watching. Angle 1, the child's world. For Japanese children in 1945, time had fractured. The war years felt endless, yet the peace arrived without clarity or celebration. Many had lost siblings in air raids. Some had never known a full year of school. Play, once a private refuge, had been replaced by drills, evacuations, and hunger. Toys were not entertainment. They were memory. Before the war, toys had marked seasonal festivals and family rituals. During the war, they vanished. Factories that once made dolls and wooden trains were converted to military production. Rubber and metal were confiscated. Children learned to fashion playthings from scraps, if they played at all. When an American soldier handed over a toy, it disrupted a child's internal logic. This object did not come from a parent or a teacher. It came from someone they had been taught to fear. The moment often froze. Children hesitated, watching adult faces for cues that never came. Photographs from Tokyo, Yokosuka, and Osaka show the same expressions: wide eyes, guarded hands, cautious acceptance. The toy itself is almost incidental. A stuffed animal, a bull, a small wooden figure. What mattered was a gesture, a signal that the war's rules no longer applied. Angle 2, the American soldier. The average American soldier in Japan in late 1945 was young. Many had fought on islands where civilians rarely survived combat. Others arrived after the surrender, carrying the stories of Iwo Jima and Okinawa but not the memories themselves. They encountered a defeated enemy that looked nothing like the one described in training manuals. Instead of fanatical resistance, they saw children scavenging for coal and women trading family heirlooms for rice. The emotional whiplash was profound. Some soldiers wrote home about these encounters. Letters described guilt, confusion, and a sense of obligation. Giving away a toy or a chocolate bar became a way to reconnect with normal life, to assert personal morality after months of impersonal violence. Angle 3. Psychological warfare turned human. Occupation planners understood that behavior mattered. Every interaction was a message. Kindness, even when unofficial, eroded resistance more effectively than force. The sight of children accepting gifts from American soldiers quietly dismantled years of propaganda. No orders were issued to distribute toys. No speeches announced a policy of generosity. Yet these acts spread organically, shaping perception one child at a time. By early 1946, fear had not vanished, but it had begun to lose its grip, setting the stage for broader changes driven not only by policy, but by human contact. Angle 4. Leadership and policy. At the highest level, the occupation was carefully choreographed. General Douglas MacArthur understood that Japan's defeat had to be decisive but not vindictive. He resisted calls for mass punishment and insisted that order, dignity, and continuity were essential to rebuilding the nation. MacArthur rarely spoke publicly about children, but his directives shaped their reality. By preserving existing administrative structures and preventing widespread chaos, he created space for civilian life to resume. Schools reopened under new curricula. Militarist education was purged. Children were no longer taught to die for the emperor. They were taught to read, calculate, and think critically. Within this framework, the behavior of individual soldiers mattered. Commanders were instructed to maintain strict discipline, but also to avoid unnecessary harshness. Reports from military government teams noted that calm interactions with civilians reduced tension and improved cooperation. The occupation's legitimacy rested not only on power, but on restraint. Angle 5. The Japanese adult perspective. For parents, the sight of American soldiers offering gifts to their children was unsettling. These were the same soldiers whose aircraft had burned their cities. Accepting kindness felt dangerous, morally and socially. Some parents bowed deeply. Others refused at first. Many watched silently, allowing their children to decide. In diaries and later oral histories, adults recalled feeling both relief and shame. Relief that their children were treated gently. Shame that defeat had placed them in a position of dependence. Yet over time, pragmatism prevailed. Survival required adaptation. As food shortages eased and violence failed to materialize, fear softened into wary acceptance. The children's reactions often led the way. Their ability to accept a toy without resentment signaled a future unburdened by the past. Angle 6. The camera and the record. The occupation of Japan became one of the most photographed moments of the post-war world. Military photographers documented everything, from political meetings to street life. Civilian journalists followed. So did amateur soldiers with personal cameras. Images of American soldiers and Japanese children circulated widely. They appeared in U.S. newspapers, magazines, and later in textbooks. The framing was deliberate. These photographs showed control without cruelty, victory without vengeance. But beyond propaganda, they captured genuine moments. A child gripping a toy with both hands. A soldier smiling uncertainly. Adults hovering at the edge of the frame. These images endured because they revealed a truth that policy alone could not convey. By mid-1946, such encounters had become part of the occupation's texture, signaling a turning point where daily life began to outweigh the memory of war, just as deeper challenges pressed in. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was the occupation's first true test. Temperatures dropped early that year. In cities already stripped of fuel and intact housing, cold settled into every crack. Children wore layers of mismatched clothing held together with string. Schools, newly reopened, struggled to heat classrooms. In rural areas, families burned furniture to survive the nights. Food shortages sharpened the crisis. Despite American grain shipments, distribution lagged. Transportation networks were damaged. Black markets thrived. Urban children were the most visible casualties. Medical surveys conducted by occupation authorities recorded alarming rates of malnutrition. In Tokyo alone, tens of thousands of children were classified as undernourished by early 1946. Hospitals reported increases in childhood mortality tied directly to hunger and exposure. American soldiers saw this daily. They stood guard outside warehouses while children watched from a distance. They patrolled streets where thin figures lingered near mess lines. For many soldiers, the contrast between their own rations and civilian scarcity became impossible to ignore. Military regulations did not forbid compassion, but they did not instruct it either. So it spread quietly. Soldiers began slipping food through fences. Candy bars from K-rations were broken in half. Gloves were handed over on cold mornings. And increasingly, toys appeared in children's hands, not as planned relief, but as personal choices made in moments of moral clarity. These acts carried risk. Soldiers could be reprimanded for violating orders or encouraging dependency. Yet enforcement softened as commanders recognized the stabilizing effect. Reports from military government units noted improved civilian cooperation in areas where troops maintained respectful, humane relations. The Japanese public noticed as well. Newspapers, cautiously emerging from censorship reforms, began to reflect a changing tone. American soldiers were no longer portrayed solely as occupiers, but as administrators, guards, and increasingly, neighbors. Children became the bridge. Their presence disarmed suspicion in ways adult diplomacy never could. By early 1946, the sight of a child holding an American toy no longer caused crowds to stop in disbelief. It still carried weight, but it no longer felt impossible. The extraordinary was becoming ordinary, and in that normalization lay the true turning point, as these small gestures converged into something larger than any individual intended. By the spring of 1946, the occupation entered a new phase. The immediate shock of defeat had faded, replaced by the routines of survival. Trains ran more regularly. Markets stabilized. Schools resumed full schedules under revised curricula. Children, still thin, began to reclaim public spaces, walking to class, gathering near rivers, playing in vacant lots where ruins had settled into the background. It was in these ordinary settings that the occupation's emotional climax unfolded. American soldiers no longer stood apart as distant authorities. In many neighborhoods, they were familiar faces. Children recognized individual uniforms, remembered names, waved from doorways. The exchange of toys, once tentative and rare, became a quiet pattern. A soldier rotating home would give away what he could not carry. A patrol would stop briefly, not to search, but to acknowledge. These objects carried no strategic value. They did not feed a population or rebuild infrastructure. Yet their symbolic weight was immense. A toy represented surplus, proof that life could include more than endurance. For children who had grown up amid scarcity, it suggested a future that did not revolve around sacrifice. Occupation leadership took note. Without issuing formal policy, SCAP encouraged positive imagery. Military publications featured photographs of calm streets and cooperative civilians. Children appeared frequently, framed as beneficiaries of peace rather than reminders of war. The message was clear. Stability had arrived, and it was visible at ground level. Public sentiment shifted in measurable ways. Reports from local administrators indicated declining fear of American troops. Incidents of civilian noncompliance dropped. The anticipated wave of resistance never materialized. Instead, Japan entered a period of quiet adaptation. For many Japanese adults, the decisive moment came not in political announcements, but in watching their children interact freely with former enemies. When a child laughed, accepted a toy, and returned home unharmed, something irreversible occurred. The war's emotional authority dissolved. This was not reconciliation in the grand sense. Resentment and grief remained. But the cycle of fear had been broken, first in children, then in households, then across communities. By the time summer arrived, the occupation was no longer defined by its arrival, but by its presence. And what followed would shape both nations long after the soldiers themselves had gone home. The effects of those early occupation years did not fade when hunger eased or buildings were rebuilt. They settled quietly into memory, especially among the youngest survivors. Children who had lived through the war and occupation entered adolescence in a transformed Japan. By the late 1940s, food supplies stabilized. School lunch programs expanded with American support, providing consistent nutrition for millions. Educational reforms emphasized democratic values, cooperation, and individual thought. Militaristic rituals vanished from classrooms. For many children, the occupation marked the first time authority felt distant rather than absolute. The memory of American soldiers was shaped less by uniforms than by gestures. In post-war surveys and later oral histories, adults who had been children in 1945 often recalled small moments: a piece of chocolate, a glove, a toy pressed into their hands. These recollections endured because they stood apart from trauma. They represented kindness without obligation. On a national level, the occupation succeeded in its primary objectives. Japan did not collapse into unrest. It did not return to militarism. Instead, it embarked on a rapid political and economic restructuring. The new constitution, enacted in 1947, renounced war and limited military power. Democratic institutions took root under American supervision but Japanese administration. The relationship between the United States and Japan shifted accordingly. Former enemies became strategic partners. By the time the occupation formally ended in 1952, the foundation for alliance had already been laid, not only through treaties and policy, but through public sentiment shaped years earlier. American veterans carried these experiences home as well. Many spoke of Japan differently from other theaters of war. The absence of sustained hostility surprised them. The children they encountered challenged simplified narratives of enemy and ally. These outcomes were not inevitable. They emerged from countless interactions at ground level, moments rarely recorded in official documents, but decisive in shaping trust. Yet memory is never singular. Alongside gratitude existed resentment. Not all encounters were benign. Hardship, inequality, and power imbalance remained realities of occupation life. Acknowledging this complexity is essential to understanding what came next, as individual memories intersected with national identity. As decades passed, the occupation receded into history, but its impressions lingered, preserved not only in archives, but in personal objects and stories carried across generations. In Japan, some families kept the toys: a small wooden truck, a cloth doll, a rubber ball, patched and repaired over years. These items survived because they were never ordinary. Museums and local history centers later collected similar artifacts, identifying them as symbols of post-war transition rather than childhood play. They represented the moment when fear first loosened its grip. Oral histories gathered in the 1970s and 1980s reveal a striking consistency. Former children described American soldiers not in terms of victory or defeat, but behavior. Calm voices, gentle hands, the absence of punishment. These memories did not erase the suffering of war, but they coexisted with it, complicating a narrative that might otherwise have hardened into resentment. American veterans, too, revisited these moments. Memoirs and interviews often mention Japan as a place of moral reckoning. Soldiers recalled expecting hostility and instead encountering hunger. Giving away a toy or a ration became a way to assert humanity after participating in destruction. For some, it was the act that allowed them to reconcile their role in the war. Culturally, these memories fed into a broader reimagining of Japan's post-war identity. Children who experienced occupation kindness grew into adults during the economic recovery of the 1950s and 1960s. Their early exposure to Americans was not shaped solely by conflict, but by contact. This did not dictate policy, but it softened public attitudes at a critical juncture. Historians caution against romanticizing the occupation. Power imbalances were real. Hardships persisted. Yet even critical scholarship acknowledges the significance of everyday interaction in preventing prolonged hostility. Trust did not emerge from documents alone. It emerged from behavior. By the time occupation forces departed, Japan had already internalized a new normal. The presence of American soldiers no longer defined daily life, but their early conduct had left a durable imprint. What remained was the question of meaning. How such small acts could carry such weight, and what they reveal about war's aftermath when viewed through the eyes of children. War leaves scars that are visible, ruined buildings, broken families, empty streets. But it also leaves traces that are invisible, felt in memory, emotion, and the choices people make when the guns fall silent. In Japan, 1945 to 1946 became a period where those invisible traces were most apparent. Children, standing among rubble with thin coats and empty hands, encountered the first gestures of peace in the form of a small toy, a glove, a piece of candy. These acts were simple, yet profound. They did not rebuild cities, nor did they settle political accounts. They did something subtler. They reminded humans of their capacity for care, even across lines drawn by conflict. For the children who received them, these moments challenged the lessons of fear and hatred taught by years of war. For the soldiers who gave them, they offered a fragile redemption, a chance to witness life restored rather than taken. The significance of these interactions extended far beyond the objects themselves. They shaped perceptions of the occupiers, influenced family memories, and quietly prepared a society for reconstruction and reconciliation. They illustrated that war's conclusion is never solely defined by treaties and surrender documents, but by the human connections forged when conflict ends. In this quiet, ordinary way, the story of American soldiers sharing toys with Japanese children became a symbol, not of conquest or victory, but of the fragile, enduring power of humanity, small, tender, and persistent even in the shadow of devastation. It is a reminder that in the aftermath of destruction, hope often arrives in the hands of the smallest recipients, and in gestures that seem, at first, impossibly simple.